My name is David, and I've always thought of myself as a practical man. I'm the kind of guy who fixes things around the house, keeps a routine, and prides himself on stability. My wife, Claire, on the other hand, is my polar opposite, free-spirited, impulsive, and with a knack for making every moment dramatic. It's part of what attracted me to her, but lately, that spark has turned into something harder to pin down, something unsettling. Our story begins on a particularly cold and rainy morning. Claire had been complaining about the fireplace for weeks. "It's not giving enough heat," she'd whined, her voice sharp, as she stood in her silk robe, holding her morning coffee like it was the only thing tethering her to the planet. "You need to do something about it, David." "I'll call someone," I replied, flipping through the mail without looking up. I could feel her glare before she even spoke. "That's what you said last month." Her tone cut through the room, and I clenched my teeth. "Fine, I'll call today." By noon, I'd booked a chimney sweep. It wasn't the sort of job I could handle on my own, and frankly, I wasn't in the mood to try. Claire spent most of her day scrolling on her phone or gabbing with her friends about the latest drama at her yoga studio. If she wasn't worried about the cost, why should I? The chimney sweep, a guy named Mike, arrived the next morning. He was around my age, mid-30s, but far more muscular and self-assured. His uniform was spotless, his tools neatly organized. "Morning, Mr. Kane," he said, his voice deep and warm. "Looks like a straightforward job." I showed him to the fireplace and excused myself. Claire hadn't come downstairs yet, and I wasn't going to wait around for her critique. I had work to do, emails to answer, spreadsheets to organize. My home office became my sanctuary, and I let the sounds of scraping and brushing fade into the background. By lunchtime, I ventured downstairs. Mike was still at work, his shirt slightly damp from the effort. Claire was standing by the fireplace, a little too close, laughing at something he'd said. She was wearing one of her tight sweaters, the kind that showed off every curve, and her hair was freshly curled. "Everything okay here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Mike straightened up and gave me a polite smile. "All good, sir. Just about done. Your wife's been keeping me company." I caught the way Claire's lips twitched into a coy smile. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture I knew all too well. It was her go-to move when she wanted attention. My stomach tightened, but I said nothing. After Mike left, I noticed Claire was in unusually high spirits. She hummed while cleaning the kitchen, something she hadn't done in months. At dinner, she was more talkative than usual, even affectionate. "I think he did a great job," she said, her green eyes sparkling as she sipped her wine. "Don't you think the fireplace looks better already?" I nodded, pretending to care. But a seed of doubt had been planted. I didn't want to admit it, not even to myself, but something about the way she looked at Mike nod at me. I pushed the thought away, convinced I was being ridiculous. "Let's enjoy dinner," I said, forcing a smile. Claire raised her glass in agreement, but her mind seemed elsewhere. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't help but wonder if the warmth I'd felt from the fireplace earlier had less to do with the chimney sweep's work and more to do with something else entirely. The days following Mike's visit were strangely quiet, yet there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite place. Claire seemed lighter, more carefree. She started wearing makeup even when she wasn't planning to leave the house, a subtle, but noticeable change. When I asked her about it, she shrugged and smiled. "I just feel like looking nice," she said, brushing past me in the hallway. The scent of her perfume lingered, a new floral fragrance I didn't recognize. Work kept me busy, as always. I spent long hours in my home office, surrounded by spreadsheets and conference calls, while Claire flitted through the house like a bird that had just been let out of its cage. I told myself I was imagining things, that this was just Claire being Claire. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. One afternoon, as I stepped out of my office to grab a cup of coffee, I heard Claire's laughter echoing from the living room. It was a high-pitched giggle, the kind she usually reserved for her girlfriends or when she'd had too much wine. But this time, she was on the phone. I lingered by the doorway, trying not to seem obvious. "Oh, stop," she said, her voice playful. "You're terrible. But yeah, I guess I could use some help." Her tone shifted, becoming softer. I didn't catch the rest of the conversation, but when she hung up, she noticed me standing there. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Claire didn't miss a beat. "Yeah, just talking to Sarah. She's having boy trouble again." I nodded, pretending to believe her, though I knew Sarah was happily married and the last person to complain about her love life. Claire flashed me a quick smile before walking past, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. That evening, as we sat down for dinner, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. Claire was animated, recounting a story about her yoga class, but her words barely registered. I was too busy studying her face, her gestures, trying to decipher the puzzle she'd become. "You're awfully quiet," she said, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Just tired," I replied, forcing a smile. "Work's been brutal this week." She nodded, her gaze lingering on me for a moment too long before turning back to her plate. I wondered if she could sense my unease, if she knew I was starting to notice the cracks in her facade. The next day, I decided to take a break from work and run some errands. As I pulled out of the driveway, I noticed Claire standing by the window, her phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was intense, her free hand gesturing as she spoke. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but the look on her face told me it wasn't about Sarah's boy trouble. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I pushed it aside. I needed to focus on my errands, groceries, dry cleaning, a quick stop at the hardware store. Yet, even as I checked items off my list, my mind kept circling back to Claire. When I returned home, I found her sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Good timing," she said. "I was just thinking about ordering dinner. What do you feel like?" I hesitated for a moment, then forced myself to play along. "Whatever you want is fine." The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but the tension in my chest didn't let up. I kept replaying her expression at the window, the way she quickly ended her phone call when I walked in earlier. Something was off, and I needed to figure out what. That night, as Claire slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The pieces weren't adding up, and I was beginning to suspect that whatever was happening wasn't just in my head. The following morning, I decided to take a closer look at her phone. Claire was in the shower, humming softly, when I saw it lying on the nightstand. My hands shook as I picked it up, my heart pounding in my ears. I knew it was wrong, but I couldn't help myself. The screen was locked, of course, and Claire had recently changed her passcode. A fresh wave of suspicion washed over me as I set the phone back down, my mind reeling. Claire had never been the type to hide things from me, or so I thought. By the time she came out of the shower, wrapped in a towel, I was back in the kitchen, sipping my coffee and pretending to read the news. She kissed me on the cheek as she passed, her hair damp and her skin glowing. "I'm meeting Sarah for lunch," she said casually. "Don't wait up if I'm late." I nodded, my throat dry. "Have fun." As she walked out the door, I felt a strange mixture of anger and fear bubbling inside me. I didn't know where she was going or who she was meeting, but I was determined to find out. It was supposed to be a normal day, but something inside me was unsettled. Claire had left that morning dressed in a skirt and blouse that hugged her figure, her hair perfectly styled, her perfume lingering in the air long after she walked out. "Lunch with Sarah," she'd said, flashing a smile. But I didn't believe her. The unease gnawed at me until I couldn't focus on work. I found myself pacing the house, glancing at the clock, and checking my phone for any updates or messages from Claire. None came. Around noon, I decided to take a drive. Maybe clearing my head would help, I thought. But as I backed out of the driveway, I found myself heading not toward the hardware store or the park but toward a part of town I didn't frequent, the area near the industrial district where I remembered Mike, the chimney sweep, had said his business was located. The thought was absurd. It was probably just my paranoia getting the better of me. But my gut was screaming, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I parked a block away from the address I'd looked up earlier that morning. Mike's van was there, parked in the driveway of a small, nondescript house. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, debating my next move. Just as I was about to convince myself to leave, the front door opened. Claire stepped out. She was laughing, her head tilted back, her hair catching the midday sun. Behind her, Mike appeared, his hand brushing against her lower back as they walked toward the van. My stomach dropped. It wasn't just the sight of them together, it was the way she looked at him. That smile, the way her body leaned slightly toward his, the effortless intimacy. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, snapping a photo through the windshield. They didn't notice me. I watched as Claire climbed into Mike's van, and they drove off. My heart was pounding, a mix of rage and disbelief surging through me. But I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof. I followed them at a safe distance, my heart racing as I navigated the streets. They ended up at a small motel just outside of town, the kind that didn't ask questions. I parked far enough away to remain unnoticed, but close enough to see them enter the building together. I waited. Minutes felt like hours, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Claire. Lunch ran late. Don't wait up for me. Love you? Love me. The audacity of those words made my blood boil. My wife was inside that motel, and here she was texting me like nothing was wrong, like she wasn't with another man. I sat in the car for what felt like an eternity, the motel's neon sign flickering in my peripheral vision. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stepped out of the car, my fists clenched, and walked toward the entrance. The woman at the front desk didn't even glance up as I passed. The door to their room wasn't locked. It opened with a soft creak, revealing a scene that burned itself into my memory. There they were, tangled in the sheets, the air thick with betrayal. Claire's head turned toward me, her eyes widening in shock and horror. "David!" she gasped, scrambling to cover herself with the sheet. Mike sat up, his face a mix of panic and defiance. "This isn't what it looks like," he stammered, but even he didn't seem to believe his own words. My voice was calm, too calm. "Not what it looks like?" I asked, stepping inside. "So you're telling me my wife, half naked in a motel room with the guy who cleaned our chimney, is just a misunderstanding?" Claire clutched the sheet to her chest, her face pale. "David, please. Let me explain." "Explain?" I cut her off, my voice rising. "What exactly is there to explain, Claire? You lied to me. You betrayed me. And now I'm standing here, staring at the proof." Tears streamed down her face, but I didn't care. Not this time. I turned to Mike, who was fumbling for his clothes. "You'd better get out of here," I growled. "Before I do something we'll both regret." Mike didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his shirt and bolted, leaving Claire and me alone in the room. "David," she started, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I laughed bitterly. "No, Claire. A mistake is burning dinner or forgetting an anniversary. This," I gestured to the bed. "This is a choice. And you made it." She sobbed, reaching for me, but I stepped back. The anger, the humiliation, the betrayal, it was too much. I couldn't look at her anymore. "I'm going home," I said coldly. "When you're done here, you can figure out what's next. But don't think for a second that I'm going to just forget this." I walked out, slamming the door behind me. My chest heaved as I got into the car and gripped the steering wheel. The image of them together replayed in my mind, searing itself into my soul. This wasn't the end, I knew that much. But it was the beginning of something I never wanted to face, the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my wife and my marriage. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The betrayal I just witnessed looped through my mind like a cruel, unending reel. By the time I pulled into the driveway, My rage had simmered into something colder, more calculating. The house was eerily quiet as I stepped inside. The fireplace Claire had been so insistent on fixing cast a soft glow across the living room, but it did nothing to warm the bitterness in my chest. I poured myself a drink, the burn of whiskey doing little to dull the ache. Claire texted me an hour later. "David, please. Let's talk. I'm coming home." I didn't reply. Instead, I downed the rest of my drink and waited. I wasn't going to make this easy for her. When Claire finally walked through the door, her face was pale, her mascara smudged from crying. She looked at me, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. "David," she began softly, closing the door behind her. "Can we sit down? Please?" I stood there, arms crossed, my silence heavy. She shifted uncomfortably under my glare, then finally moved to the couch and sat down. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "A terrible, stupid mistake." I barked out a bitter laugh. "A mistake? Is that what we're calling it now? Sneaking off to a motel with another man is just a little oopsie?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "It wasn't like that. Don't insult me, Claire," I snapped. "I saw you. I heard you lying to me, pretending you were out with Sarah. So don't stand there and act like this was some innocent misunderstanding." She wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "I wasn't thinking. I felt lost. We've been so distant, David. You're always working, and I felt invisible." "Invisible?" My voice rose, incredulous. "You felt invisible, so you jumped into bed with the first guy who paid you a compliment? That's your excuse?" "It wasn't like that," she insisted. "Mike, it just happened." I shook my head, disgusted. "No, Claire. It didn't just happen. You made a choice. You planned this. You lied to me, over and over again. And now you want me to believe this is about me? About us?" She sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then the image of her with Mike, her smile, her touch, flashed in my mind, and the pity vanished. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice cold. "I need space. David, please," she begged, reaching for me. "We can fix this. We can go to counseling. I'll do whatever it takes." I stepped back, her touch repelling me. "You've already done enough, Claire. I need time to figure out what the hell I'm supposed to do with this mess." Her sobs echoed through the house as I turned and walked upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind me. I stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, breathing heavily. My anger wasn't fading, it was evolving. If Claire thought she could manipulate her way out of this, she was dead wrong. The next morning, I woke early, the weight of the previous night still heavy on my chest. Claire was nowhere to be seen, but I didn't care. I needed to clear my head, so I went for a drive, ending up at a coffee shop on the edge of town. I sat in a corner booth, staring blankly at my untouched coffee. My mind churned with thoughts of revenge, of justice. I wasn't going to let Claire off the hook so easily. She'd humiliated me, destroyed my trust, and now, she needed to feel the same pain she'd inflicted. As I sipped my coffee, an idea began to form. Claire's best friend, Julia, had always been overly friendly with me. She'd flirted at parties, laughed a little too hard at my jokes, and touched my arm a little too often. At the time, I'd brushed it off, chalking it up to her playful personality. But now, in my current state, her behavior took on a new meaning. If Claire could betray me with Mike, maybe it was time to show her that two could play this game. When I got home later that morning, Claire was in the kitchen making breakfast. Her eyes were red, her movements slow and hesitant. She glanced at me as I walked in, her expression pleading. "David," she began, but I held up a hand to silence her. "I don't want to talk right now," I said curtly. "I have things to do." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. I turned away, grabbing my phone and texting Julia. "Hey. You free to grab a drink later?" Could use some company. Her reply came almost immediately. Of course. Everything okay? I stared at her message, my lips curling into a bitter smile. Not really. But I'll explain when we meet. Later that evening, as I sat across from Julia at a dimly lit bar, I felt the beginnings of a plan take shape. Claire thought she could break me, but she was about to learn that I wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold. The dim glow of the bar cast flickering shadows across Julia's face. She looked radiant in her figure-hugging red dress, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. Her warm smile and the soft touch of her hand on my arm could have fooled anyone into thinking we were a happy couple. I swirled my drink slowly, letting the whiskey burn as I savored the bitter satisfaction of my plan. I was surprised you texted me, Julia said, her voice tinged with curiosity. You're not usually the type to reach out like this. What's going on? I gave her a small, self-deprecating smile. It's Claire. Julia's expression darkened slightly. What's she done now? The bitterness in her tone caught my attention. I leaned back in my chair studying her. Claire had often mentioned how close she and Julia were, but over the years, I'd noticed the subtle undercurrent of competition between them. Julia never said it outright, but there was always a glint of jealousy when Claire talked about her latest achievements or showed off new jewelry I'd bought her. She's been distant, I said carefully, testing the waters. More than usual. And then I found out she's been lying to me. Julia's eyes widened slightly, and she leaned closer. Lying? About what? I hesitated, pretending to struggle with my emotions. I don't want to go into too much detail. Let's just say, she hasn't been faithful. Julia's lips parted, her hand flying to her chest in mock shock. No way. Claire? That's awful, David. You don't deserve that. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the ice in my glass. I don't know what to do, Julia. I thought we had a good thing, but now I feel like a fool. Her hand tightened on my arm. You're not a fool, David. You're one of the good ones. If she can't see that, it's her loss. I looked up, locking eyes with her. You really think so? She blushed slightly but didn't look away. Of course. You're smart, kind, loyal, and not to mention handsome. Her boldness caught me off guard, but it also confirmed what I'd suspected. Julia wasn't just being friendly, there was something more beneath the surface. I don't know how I'm supposed to move on from this, I said, letting a hint of vulnerability creep into my voice. It's like everything I thought I knew about my life has been ripped away. You don't have to go through this alone, Julia said, her voice soft. I'm here for you. Whatever you need. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I took another sip of my drink, letting the tension build. Thank you, Julia. That means a lot. The evening ended with a hug that lingered just a second too long. Julia's perfume clung to me as I drove home, the beginnings of my revenge plan falling into place. If Claire wanted to play dirty, I would show her what it felt like to be on the receiving end. When I got home, Claire was waiting for me in the living room. She looked worn, her makeup smudged, her eyes red from crying. Where were you? She asked, her voice shaky. Out, I replied coldly, tossing my keys onto the counter. With who? She pressed, standing up. You didn't even tell me you were leaving. I didn't think I needed to. I shot back, my voice sharp. But if you must know, I met up with Julia. Her face froze, the color draining from her cheeks. Julia? She repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Why? She's a friend, I said casually, brushing past her. Unlike some people, she actually cares about me. Claire flinched, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction. I didn't owe her any explanations, not after what she'd done. Without another word, I headed upstairs, leaving her standing there, stunned and silent. Over the next few days, I made sure to keep my interactions with Claire short and icy. I wasn't going to let her off the hook, but I also wasn't ready to reveal my hand. Instead, I focused on deepening my connection with Julia. We started texting regularly, little jokes, compliments, and subtle flirtations. She was eager, responding within seconds and often sending selfies that showed off her outfits or the meals she was cooking. It didn't take long before she suggested meeting up again. "Why don't you come over?" she texted one evening. "I'll make dinner, and we can talk more." I stared at the screen, the wheels in my head turning. This was it, the next step in my plan. I typed a quick reply. "I'd like that." "Tomorrow night?" Her response came almost immediately. "Perfect. Can't wait to see you." Smiling face with smiling eyes. The following evening, I made sure Claire saw me getting ready. I chose a crisp shirt, spritzed on cologne, and even polished my shoes, things I hadn't done in months. She watched from the couch, her eyes following my every move. "Where are you going?" she finally asked, her voice brittle. "Out," I replied, smoothing my shirt. "Don't wait up." Her jaw tightened, but she didn't say anything. As I walked out the door, I felt a rush of adrenaline. Claire had no idea what was coming, but soon she would. Julia's house was warm and inviting, the soft glow of candles casting flickering shadows across the walls. She greeted me at the door in a sleek black dress, her hair styled to perfection, her smile wide and welcoming. "You look amazing," I said, stepping inside and handing her a bottle of wine. Her cheeks flushed. "You're too kind, David. Dinner's almost ready. Make yourself at home." The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the air as I followed her into the kitchen. She'd gone all out: steak, roasted vegetables, and a decadent chocolate cake for dessert. It was clear she was trying to impress me, and I let her. "Can I help with anything?" I asked, leaning against the counter. "Just keep me company," she said with a smile, pouring 2 glasses of wine. We sat at the table, and the conversation flowed easily. Julia had a way of making me feel seen, appreciated, a stark contrast to the cold indifference I'd felt from Claire over the past months. She laughed at my jokes, leaned in when I spoke, and touched my hand often. By the time dinner was over, the wine had loosened my nerves, and Julia's flirtatious glances were growing bolder. "I'm so glad you came," she said softly, her fingers brushing against mine. "You've been through so much, David. You deserve to feel wanted." Her words hung in the air, thick with implication. I looked into her eyes, the tension between us crackling like electricity. Every instinct told me to stop, to step back before this went too far. But another part of me, a darker, vengeful part, wanted to see this through. "Julia," I began, my voice low. "You've been such a good friend to me. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you." She moved closer, her breath warm against my cheek. "You don't have to thank me," she whispered. "I just want to be here for you, in any way you need." Before I could think, she leaned in, her lips brushing mine. The kiss started slow, tentative, but quickly deepened. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let the anger and betrayal I felt toward Claire fuel me, pushing me into something I never thought I'd do. The next morning, I woke up in Julia's bed, sunlight streaming through the curtains. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the satisfaction of knowing I was finally taking control of my life. Claire had destroyed my trust, shattered our marriage, and now, she would see how it felt. Julia stirred beside me, her hair tousled, a sleepy smile on her lips. "Morning," she murmured, stretching. "Morning," I replied, leaning over to kiss her forehead. "Last night, thank you." She smiled, her fingers tracing lazy circles on my chest. "You don't have to thank me, David. I meant what I said. I'm here for you." I got dressed quietly, leaving Julia still lounging in bed. As I drove home, I couldn't help but wonder how Claire would react when she found out. There was no doubt in my mind that Julia would tell her. It was only a matter of time. Part of me relished the thought of Claire's face when she realized I wasn't the pushover she thought I was. When I walked through the door, Claire was waiting for me. She sat on the couch, her arms crossed, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "Where were you?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "Out," I said flatly, shrugging off my coat. "Not that it's any of your business." Her nostrils flared, and she stood, her fists clenched. Don't play games with me, David. I know you were with Julia. I raised an eyebrow, pretending to be surprised. And how would you know that? She faltered for a moment, then snapped. She texted me. She said you two had dinner? She said you spent the night. And? I asked, crossing my arms. Why does that bother you, Claire? After all, it's not like you've been faithful. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But instead, she took a deep breath, straightening her shoulders. This isn't the same, she said, her voice shaking. You're doing this to hurt me. You're damn right I am, I said, my voice rising. Do you think I enjoy this, Claire? Do you think I wanted any of this to happen? You broke us, not me. You lied, you cheated, and now you want to play the victim? She stared at me, speechless, her chest rising and falling with the effort to hold herself together. I never meant to hurt you, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. But you did, I replied coldly. And now you get to live with the consequences. Over the next few days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Claire tried to talk to me, but I shut her down at every turn. I wasn't interested in her excuses or apologies. I was done playing the role of the forgiving husband. Julia, on the other hand, was more than willing to step into the role Claire had abandoned. She texted constantly, her messages full of warmth and affection. She was everything Claire wasn't, and while I knew my relationship with her was built on anger and revenge, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Claire, meanwhile, grew more desperate. I caught her pacing the house late at night, her face etched with worry. She tried to make small talk, tried to rekindle some semblance of normalcy, but I refused to engage. This was my life now, a cold war, fought in silence and tension. And while part of me longed for peace, another part relished watching Claire squirm. She had destroyed my trust, shattered our marriage, and now, she was finally feeling the weight of her actions. The silence in the house grew louder with each passing day. Claire's attempts to salvage what little remained of our marriage became increasingly desperate, but I wasn't ready to let her off the hook. The image of her with Mike was still burned into my mind, and no amount of tears or apologies could erase it. Meanwhile, my connection with Julia deepened. She wasn't shy about her feelings, sending me flirty texts and asking to see me again. The way she talked about me, admiring, encouraging, was a stark contrast to the cold indifference Claire had shown me for months. Part of me knew this was all wrong, but the part that craved validation and revenge pushed those thoughts aside. Claire's breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon. I was in the living room, texting Julia, when Claire stormed in. Her hair was damp, and her face was flushed with anger. We need to talk, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't even look up. I'm busy. Don't you dare dismiss me like that, David, she snapped. You've been avoiding me for weeks. We can't keep going on like this. I set my phone down and finally met her gaze. What exactly do you want to talk about, Claire? The fact that you cheated on me? The fact that you lied to my face for God knows how long? Or maybe you just want to talk about how you've managed to destroy everything we built together. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. I know I messed up, she said, her voice cracking. I know I hurt you. But you're not exactly innocent here, are you? I raised an eyebrow. What's that supposed to mean? You've been seeing Julia, she said bitterly. Do you think I don't know? She's been rubbing it in my face every chance she gets. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is for me? I leaned back, crossing my arms. Humiliating? You think this is humiliating? Claire, you cheated on me with a chimney sweep. You lied to me, manipulated me, and now you want to act like you're the victim? Her face twisted with anger and pain. You don't understand, David. I was lonely. You were always working, always too tired to notice me. I didn't do it to hurt you. But you did hurt me. I shot back. And now you're realizing what it feels like. So no, I'm not going to sit here and comfort you. You don't deserve that. She stared at me, her tears falling freely now. I don't even know who you are anymore. I gave her a cold smile. Funny. I was just thinking the same thing about you. Later that evening, I met Julia for dinner at a quiet restaurant downtown. She was glowing, her excitement contagious as she talked about our future. I can't wait until we can stop sneaking around, she said, her hand resting on mine. Claire doesn't deserve you. Her words should have felt good, but they didn't. Instead, they left a bitter taste in my mouth. Julia was everything Claire wasn't: attentive, affectionate, eager to please, but there was something about the way she talked about Claire that made me uneasy. Let's not talk about her, I said, forcing a smile. Tonight's about us. She grinned and leaned closer. You're right. I just hate seeing you unhappy. For the rest of the evening, I pushed my doubts aside and let myself enjoy Julia's company. She was beautiful, charming, and completely devoted to me. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into something far messier than I'd anticipated. When I got home, Claire was sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked up as I walked in, her expression guarded. Did you have a good time? She asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. Don't start, Claire, I warned, heading toward the stairs. But she didn't stop. Do you even care what this is doing to us? To me? I turned, my patience wearing thin. You're the one who destroyed us, Claire. Don't act like this is my fault. Her hand trembled as she gripped the glass. I made a mistake. I admitted it. I'm trying to fix things, but you're not even trying. Why should I? I shot back. You didn't care about me when you were sneaking around with Mike. Why should I care now? Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might give up. But then she squared her shoulders, her voice turning sharp. You're not just punishing me, David. You're punishing yourself. And one day, you're going to realize that. I didn't respond. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving her alone in the kitchen. Her words echoed in my mind, but I pushed them aside. I wasn't ready to forgive her, or myself. The following day, Claire packed a bag and left. She didn't say where she was going, and I didn't ask. The house felt emptier without her, but it also felt quieter, almost peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe. But peace didn't last long. Julia was thrilled when I told her Claire had left, assuming it meant we were one step closer to being together. She started texting me constantly, planning our next meeting, talking about the future. At first, I went along with it, but the more time I spent with her, the more I realized how little I actually knew her. And then, Claire came back. She wasn't the broken woman I'd seen before. This time, she was determined, and she was ready to fight. Claire returned late in the evening, a suitcase in hand and a steely look in her eyes. Gone was the tearful, desperate woman I'd left standing in the kitchen days ago. She looked composed, determined, like someone ready for a battle. I was sitting in the living room when she walked in. The door closed softly behind her, and she set her suitcase down with deliberate care. Our eyes met, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The air between us was thick with unspoken tension. You're back, I said finally, my tone neutral. Yes, she replied, her voice calm but firm. We need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Haven't we talked enough? She shook her head, her expression unyielding. No, David. We haven't. You've been avoiding me, shutting me out, and now you're running around with Julia like this is some kind of game. Her words stung, but I didn't let it show. You don't get to lecture me, Claire. Not after what you did. I'm not trying to excuse what I did, she said, stepping closer. But this, what you're doing, it's not going to fix anything. It's just making everything worse. I scoffed, shaking my head. You think I'm trying to fix things? You cheated on me, Claire. You broke us. I'm done trying to fix anything. Her jaw tightened, and she looked away for a moment, collecting her thoughts. I know I hurt you, David. I know I broke your trust. But what you're doing with Julia, it's cruel. Not just to me, but to her too. She thinks you're serious about her. She's an adult. I shot back. She knows what she's getting into. Does she? Claire asked, her voice cutting. Or is she just a pawn in your revenge scheme? Her words struck a nerve, but I refused to show it. Instead, I stood and walked past her toward the kitchen, grabbing a glass of water. She followed, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. You're angry, and you have every right to be, she said, her tone softening. But this isn't you, David. You're not the kind of man who uses people like this. I turned to face her, my anger boiling over. And what kind of man am I, Claire? The kind who stays home, works hard, and trusts his wife while she's out screwing someone else. Her face crumpled, and for a moment I thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she straightened her shoulders and met my gaze head-on. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said quietly. But I still love you, David. And I'm not giving up on us, not without a fight. Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. I stared at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman I'd married. But all I could see was the betrayal, the lies, the image of her and Mike in that motel room. I can't do this, Claire, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't look at you without seeing what you did. Her breath hitched, and she nodded slowly, as if she'd expected my answer but still hoped for something different. I understand, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm not giving up, David. I'm not. The next day, I met Julia for lunch. She was her usual cheerful self, chatting about her plans for the weekend and telling me how much better I deserved than Claire. But for the first time, her words felt hollow. You seem quiet today, she said, tilting her head. Is everything okay? Yeah, I lied, forcing a smile. Just a lot on my mind. She reached across the table, her hand covering mine. You don't have to carry it all alone, you know. I'm here for you. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to meet her gaze. The truth was, Julia was starting to feel less like a refuge and more like a complication. Claire's words kept echoing in my mind, and I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was spiraling further into a mess I didn't know how to untangle. When I got home that evening, Claire was in the living room, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked up as I walked in, her expression wary. David, she said hesitantly. Can we talk? I sighed, setting my keys on the counter. What now, Claire? I've been thinking, she said, holding up the papers. About everything. About us. I frowned, stepping closer. What are those? Divorce papers, she said quietly. I drafted them this morning. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't expected this, not from her. I thought she was determined to fight, to win me back. But now, here she was, offering me an out. You're serious? I asked, my voice laced with disbelief. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I love you, David. But if you can't forgive me, if you can't move past this, then maybe it's time we both let go. I stared at her, my mind racing. This was what I thought I wanted, freedom, a fresh start. But now that it was right in front of me, it felt wrong. I don't know what I want, I admitted, my voice cracking. Claire gave me a sad smile. Then take your time. Figure it out. But just know, David, I'm still here. And I still believe in us. Claire's words stayed with me long after she'd gone upstairs, leaving the divorce papers on the coffee table. I sat there, staring at them, the black ink stark against the crisp white pages. This was what I thought I wanted, a clean break, an end to the betrayal and lies. But now, faced with the reality of it, I felt an unexpected pang of uncertainty. I poured myself a drink and sat in silence, the weight of my choices pressing down on me. On one hand, there was Claire, the woman I had loved for over a decade, the woman who had betrayed me in the worst way. On the other hand, there was Julia, new, exciting, and a willing participant in my quest for revenge. But as much as I tried to justify my actions with Julia, deep down, I knew they were rooted in anger, not genuine connection. I didn't sleep much that night. The house was too quiet, the ticking of the clock too loud. By morning, I felt like a shell of myself, my thoughts tangled in knots I couldn't untie. Claire was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her hair pulled back, her face bare of makeup. She looked tired but resolute. "Morning," she said softly, her eyes flicking toward me before returning to her coffee. "Morning," I muttered, grabbing a mug and pouring myself a cup. The silence between us was heavy, but neither of us seemed willing to break it. Finally she spoke. "Have you thought about the papers?" I nodded slowly, staring into my coffee. "Yeah, I've thought about them." "And?" she asked, her voice tentative. I took a deep breath, setting my mug down. "I don't know, Claire. I don't know what the right answer is." Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if she'd been holding her breath. "I understand," she said quietly. "But I need you to decide, David. I can't live in this limbo forever." Her words stung because they were true. This back and forth, this cold war between us, was exhausting. But making a decision felt impossible. Every choice led to pain, either the pain of ending things for good, or the pain of trying to rebuild something that might already be broken beyond repair. That afternoon, I met Julia at a coffee shop. She was radiant as always, her smile wide and her laugh infectious. But for the first time, being with her felt wrong. Like I was playing a part in a drama I no longer wanted to star in. "You're quiet," she said, tilting her head. "What's on your mind?" I hesitated, swirling my coffee. "A lot," I admitted. Claire came back. Her expression darkened. "And?" "She brought divorce papers," I said, watching her reaction carefully. Julia's lips curled into a faint smile. "Good. That's what you wanted, right? To move on?" "Yeah," I said slowly. "I thought so." Her hand reached across the table, resting on mine. "David, you deserve better than her. You deserve someone who values you, who sees how amazing you are." Her words were sweet, but they felt hollow. I forced a smile, nodding. "Thanks, Julia." We spent another hour together, but the spark I'd once felt with her was gone. By the time we parted ways, I knew I couldn't keep stringing her along. Julia deserved more than to be a pawn in my messy revenge game. When I got home, Claire was in the backyard, tending to the garden she'd neglected for months. I watched her through the window, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked different. Softer, quieter, more vulnerable. I stepped outside, the crisp air biting at my skin. She glanced up as I approached, her eyes wary. "Hi," I said, shoving my hands into my pockets. "Hi," she replied, brushing dirt off her hands. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then I cleared my throat. "I saw Julia today." Her expression flickered, but she didn't say anything. "I think I'm done with her," I said, surprising even myself with the words. Claire's eyes widened slightly, her lips parting in shock. "Why?" "Because this isn't who I want to be," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want to spend my life being angry, trying to hurt you, trying to hurt myself." She nodded slowly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I never wanted this, David. I never wanted to hurt you. But you did," I said, my tone even. "And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." Her tears spilled over, but she didn't look away. "I understand." We stood there in silence, the weight of our shared pain hanging between us. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of clarity. "I need time," I said finally. "I can't make any decisions right now. But I think I need to figure out who I am, outside of all of this." Claire nodded, wiping her tears. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." That night, I slept on the couch, the divorce papers still sitting untouched on the coffee table. For the first time in weeks, the house felt a little less heavy. But I knew the road ahead was still long, still uncertain. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but for the first time, I felt like I was ready to start walking it. The next few days passed in a strange, fragile calm. Claire and I lived like two strangers occupying the same space, speaking only when necessary. The divorce papers remained on the coffee table, an unspoken elephant in the room. Every time I walked past them, I felt their weight, as if they were staring back at me, demanding a decision I wasn't ready to make. Claire, for her part, seemed to be trying. She cooked dinner each night, small gestures meant to bridge the chasm between us. But I wasn't ready to meet her halfway, not yet. One evening, as we sat at the dining table in silence, Claire finally broke it. "David," she began hesitantly, her fork hovering over her plate. "I've been thinking maybe we should try counseling." I set my glass down, fixing her with a skeptical look. "Counseling? After everything?" She nodded, her expression earnest. "I know I don't deserve another chance, but I want to try. I want to understand what went wrong and how we got here." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. "You think a counselor is going to fix this? Fix us?" Her gaze dropped to her plate. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm willing to try if you are." I considered her words, the quiet desperation in her voice. Counseling felt like a long shot, an attempt to salvage something that might already be beyond saving. But part of me wondered if it was worth a try, if only to prove to myself that I'd done everything I could. "I'll think about it," I said finally. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, a glimmer of hope shining through. "That's all I'm asking." Later that night, as I lay on the couch, staring at the ceiling, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. Julia's name flashed across the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hey," I said, my voice low. "Hi," she replied, her tone light but tinged with curiosity. "You've been quiet lately. Is everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied. "Just a lot going on." She paused, then said, "I miss you, David. When can I see you again?" I closed my eyes, the weight of her words pressing down on me. Julia had been my escape, my distraction, but now she felt like another complication I couldn't afford. "I don't know, Julia," I said honestly. "Things are complicated right now." Her tone shifted, becoming sharper. "Complicated how? You're not going back to her, are you?" "I didn't say that," I replied, my patience wearing thin. "I just need time to figure things out." She scoffed, her frustration clear. "Time? David, I've been there for you through all of this. And now you're pulling away? It's not about you," I said, pinching the bridge of my nose. "I just need space." The line went quiet for a moment before Julia spoke again, her voice cold. "I hope you know what you're doing, David. Because if you go back to her, after everything she's done, you'll regret it." She hung up before I could respond. I stared at the phone in my hand, her words echoing in my mind. For the first time, I realized just how deep I'd let myself sink into this mess. The following morning, Claire approached me as I was getting ready to leave for work. She held a steaming mug of coffee, her expression tentative. "I made this for you," she said, handing me the mug. "I know it's not much, but I want to start somewhere." I took the mug, the warmth seeping into my hands. "Thanks," I said quietly. She lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say more. "David, I know I can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I'm still here, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I met her gaze, searching for any sign of the woman I used to know. "We'll see," I said, my tone measured. At work, I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to Claire, to Julia, to the tangled web of decisions I had made since discovering Claire's betrayal. I felt like a man standing at a crossroads, with no clear path forward. By lunchtime, I'd made up my mind to take a drive and clear my head. I ended up at a small park on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where families picnicked and children played on sunny days. But today, it was quiet, the overcast sky casting everything in shades of gray. I sat on a bench, staring at the empty playground, and let the weight of my emotions wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to feel everything: anger, sadness, regret, and the faintest flicker of hope. I didn't know if counseling could fix what was broken, or if I even wanted to try. But one thing was clear: I couldn't keep living like this, caught between two worlds, letting my anger dictate my actions. It was time to take control of my life, one way or another. That evening, I returned home to find Claire sitting at the kitchen table, a stack of papers spread out before her. She looked up as I entered, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "David," she said softly, "did you think about what I said? About counseling?" I nodded, sitting down across from her. "I did. And I think we should try." Her eyes widened in surprise, then softened with relief. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise, I won't waste this chance." Her gratitude felt genuine, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down. "This doesn't mean I've forgiven you," I warned. "It just means I'm willing to see if there's anything left to save." She nodded, her expression serious. "I understand. And I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm committed." For the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope between us. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Claire wasted no time scheduling the counseling session. By the next morning, she'd found a therapist who specialized in couples dealing with infidelity. The appointment was set for Thursday evening. She was oddly eager, almost as if she believed this would be our salvation. I was more skeptical. The days leading up to the session passed slowly. We kept our distance, speaking only when necessary. There was a fragility to our interactions, as though any wrong move could shatter the tentative truce we'd established. Thursday evening arrived, and we drove to the counselor's office in near silence. The building was unassuming, a small brick structure tucked between a coffee shop and a bookstore. The sign outside read, "Dr. Meredith Shaw, Couples Therapy." We were greeted by a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. Dr. Shaw led us into her office, where two chairs faced a small couch. The room was cozy, lined with bookshelves and soft lighting that seemed designed to make people feel safe. Claire and I sat side by side on the couch, though there was a noticeable gap between us. Dr. Shaw settled into her chair, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Welcome," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I understand this is a difficult time for both of you. My goal here is to create a space where we can talk openly and honestly about what's happened and how to move forward. Does that sound okay?" We both nodded, though I felt a knot tighten in my chest. "Let's start with why you're here," Dr. Shaw said, looking at Claire. Claire took a deep breath, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "A terrible mistake. I cheated on David, and I broke his trust." Dr. Shaw nodded, her expression neutral. "That's a big admission. What led to this?" "I don't know," Claire said, her voice cracking. "I was feeling disconnected. David was always working, and I felt invisible. And then Mike came along, and he noticed me. He made me feel seen." Her words cut deep, but I kept my face neutral. Dr. Shaw turned to me. "David, how does it feel to hear that?" "Like an excuse," I said bluntly. "She didn't feel seen, so she decided to sleep with someone else? That's not a reason, it's selfish." Claire flinched, but Dr. Shaw held up a hand. "David, I understand your anger. Betrayal like this is incredibly painful. But it's important that we try to understand the underlying issues, even if they don't justify the behavior." I sighed, leaning back against the couch. "Fine. Then what about me? I was working my ass off to provide for us. I thought I was doing the right thing. But apparently, that wasn't enough." Dr. Shaw nodded. "It sounds like both of you had unmet needs, but instead of addressing them together, you drifted apart. Claire, how do you feel hearing David's perspective?" Tears welled up in Claire's eyes. "He's right. I should have talked to him. I should have told him how I was feeling. But I didn't, and now I've ruined everything." Dr. Shaw let the silence linger for a moment before speaking. "This is a painful situation, but it's not hopeless. Healing will take time, and it will require both of you to be honest, not just with each other, but with yourselves." The session lasted an hour, and by the end of it, I felt emotionally drained. Dr. Shaw suggested we both take some time to reflect on what we'd discussed and schedule a follow-up session the next week. As we drove home, Claire turned to me. "Thank you for coming. I know this isn't easy." "It's not," I said flatly. "And I'm still not sure if it's worth it." Her face fell, but she nodded. "I understand." That night, I lay awake, replaying the session in my mind. Dr. Shaw had asked questions that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths, not just about Claire, but about myself. I wasn't ready to forgive her, but I also wasn't ready to walk away. The next day, Julia called. I stared at her name on the screen, my thumb hovering over the decline button. Part of me wanted to answer, to lose myself in the comfort she offered. But I knew it would only complicate things further. I let the call go to voicemail, then texted her a short message. "I need space. Please don't call me for a while." Her reply came quickly. "David, what's going on? I thought we were building something." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was, I didn't know what I was building, or if I was building anything at all. Over the next week, Claire made a visible effort to rebuild my trust. She was transparent about her schedule, checking in with me throughout the day and leaving her phone out in plain sight. I wanted to believe she was sincere, but the memory of her betrayal was a constant shadow. Our next session with Dr. Shaw was equally intense. This time, we focused on communication, how we had failed to express our needs and how we could do better moving forward. "Trust is like a mirror," Dr. Shaw said. "Once it's broken, you can put the pieces back together, but it will never be the same. The question you both need to ask yourselves is whether you're willing to live with the cracks." Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. I didn't know the answer, but I was starting to think that maybe, just maybe, those cracks didn't have to define us. The days following our second counseling session felt like a delicate balancing act. Claire and I were both trying, but the weight of what had happened hung over us like a storm cloud. Every conversation was careful, every interaction measured, as if we were walking on a tightrope over a canyon of unresolved emotions. One evening, after dinner, Claire approached me as I was clearing the dishes. She leaned against the counter, her expression hesitant. "David," she began softly, "I've been thinking about what Dr. Shaw said. About the cracks in the mirror." I glanced at her, wary. "And?" She took a deep breath. "I know I can't undo what I've done. But I want to rebuild what we had. Even if it's different, even if it's imperfect. I want us to try." I dried my hands and turned to face her. "Claire, do you really think we can? Because every time I look at you, all I see is what you did. I don't know if I can live with that." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I'm willing to spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm worth another chance. But I need to know if you're willing to try." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation and hope. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could move past this. But a part of me was still drowning in anger and hurt, unable to see a way forward. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't know." That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with memories of our life together, the good, the bad, and the moments that had brought us to this point. I thought about the way Claire had looked at me on our wedding day, her eyes shining with love and promise. I thought about the laughter we'd shared, the challenges we'd faced, and the quiet moments that had made us feel unbreakable. But I also thought about Mike. About the lies, the betrayal, and the way Claire had shattered my trust. The cracks in the mirror felt too deep, too jagged, to ignore. By the time the sun rose, I felt no closer to an answer. The next morning, Claire suggested we take a walk. It was something we hadn't done in years, just the two of us, no distractions, no agenda. I agreed reluctantly, unsure of what she hoped to achieve. We strolled through the park near our house, the crisp autumn air biting at our cheeks. Claire walked slightly ahead of me, her hands tucked into the pockets of her coat. She seemed lost in thought. "I used to love coming here," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Remember? We'd bring sandwiches and sit by the lake. Yeah, I said, my tone guarded. That was a long time ago. She nodded, her gaze distant. It feels like a lifetime ago. Like we were different people back then. We were, I said. A lot has changed. She stopped walking and turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. Do you think we can find our way back? Or at least, find something new? I stared at her, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to say yes, to believe that we could rebuild something out of the rubble. But another part of me was still trapped in the pain of her betrayal, unable to let go. I don't know, Claire, I said finally. I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't. Her shoulders sagged, and she nodded slowly. I understand. But I'm not giving up, David. I can't. That evening I received a text from Julia. It had been days since I'd spoken to her, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to open the message. But curiosity got the better of me. I know you said you needed space, but I can't stop thinking about you. Please let me know if we can talk. I stared at the screen, my emotions a tangled mess. Julia had been my refuge when everything with Claire had fallen apart. She had offered me comfort, validation, and a way to escape the pain. But now, she felt like a reminder of everything I'd done wrong, of the choices I'd made out of anger and revenge. I didn't respond. Instead, I set my phone down and walked away, feeling a strange sense of relief at the thought of leaving that chapter behind. The next day, Claire and I attended another counseling session with Dr. Shaw. This time, the focus was on forgiveness, what it meant, how it could be achieved, and whether it was even possible. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, Dr. Shaw said, her voice calm and measured. It's about choosing to let go of the anger and resentment so that you can move forward. But it's not easy, and it's not quick. It's a process. I don't know if I can forgive her, I admitted, my voice heavy with emotion. Every time I think about what she did, it's like a knife in my chest. That's normal, Dr. Shaw said. Forgiveness doesn't mean the pain goes away immediately. It's a decision you make every day, little by little. And it's okay if you're not ready yet. Claire was silent for a long moment before speaking. I don't expect him to forgive me overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn it. Her words were sincere, but I wasn't sure if sincerity was enough. Forgiveness felt like an impossible mountain to climb, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength, or the desire, to try. That night, as I lay in bed, Claire reached over and took my hand. It was the first time she'd touched me in weeks, and the gesture caught me off guard. I love you, David, she whispered. No matter what happens, I want you to know that. Her words broke something inside me. I didn't respond, but I didn't pull away either. For the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself feel the tiniest flicker of hope. The morning after Claire whispered those words to me, I woke with an odd clarity. For weeks, I had been mired in indecision, torn between the wreckage of my marriage and the fleeting escape I'd found in Julia. But now, as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the divorce papers still sitting untouched on the dresser, I realized there was only one way forward. It wasn't about forgiveness or revenge anymore. It was about freedom, the freedom to stop living in the shadow of what we'd lost. Claire was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching my face for clues. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, the silence between us heavy with unspoken words. We need to talk, I said finally, my voice steady. Her hand stilled on the mug she was holding. Okay, she said softly, her tone wary. I took a deep breath, the words tumbling out before I could second-guess myself. I've been trying to figure out if I can forgive you, if I can live with what you did. And the truth is, I can't. Every time I look at you, I see Mike. I see the lies, the betrayal. And I can't get past it. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't interrupt. This isn't about anger anymore, I continued. I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of punishing you and punishing myself. I can't keep living like this. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. So, what are you saying? I'm saying it's over, I said, my chest tightening with the finality of the words. I'm saying we need to let go. Her tears spilled over, and she shook her head. David, please. I know I've hurt you. I know I've broken your trust. But I still love you. Isn't there anything I can do to fix this? I looked at her, my heart breaking despite the resolve in my decision. It's not about what you can do, Claire. It's about what I can't. I can't rebuild what we had because it's gone. It's broken, and it's not coming back. She sobbed openly now, her hands covering her face. I don't want to lose you, she choked out. I don't want to lose us. You already did, I said, my voice soft but firm. And so did I. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Claire stayed in the bedroom, and I spent hours on the phone with a lawyer, starting the process of filing for divorce. The weight that had been suffocating me for weeks began to lift, replaced by a bittersweet sense of relief. Julia texted me again, but I didn't respond. She had been a part of this mess, a symptom of the chaos, not a solution. I knew I couldn't carry her into my future, just as I couldn't carry Claire. I needed to start over, alone. When Claire emerged from the bedroom that evening, her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She sat across from me at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly together. If this is what you need, she said quietly, I won't fight you. I won't make this harder than it has to be. Thank you, I said, my voice thick with emotion. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. But I want you to know, David, that I'll always love you. Even if I couldn't be the person you deserved. Her words stayed with me long after she'd gone back upstairs, the weight of them pressing against my chest. I didn't know if I could ever fully hate her, not after everything we'd shared, not after the love we'd once had. But I also knew that love wasn't enough to save us. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of paperwork and difficult conversations. We divided our assets, packed up the house, and tried to untangle the lives we'd spent years building together. Claire moved in with a friend, and I stayed in the house, though it felt emptier with every passing day. One afternoon, as I was boxing up old photos, I came across our wedding album. I flipped through the pages, each photo a painful reminder of the promises we'd made and the future we'd imagined. I closed the album and placed it in the box, unsure if I would ever open it again. The day our divorce was finalized, I stood outside the courthouse, the weight of the moment settling over me. Claire was there too, standing a few feet away. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of sadness and acceptance. Goodbye, David, she said, her voice barely audible. Goodbye, Claire, I replied. And with that, we turned and walked in opposite directions. It's been months now, and life is slowly returning to something resembling normal. I've thrown myself into work, taken up new hobbies, and started to rebuild the pieces of my life that were shattered. I'm learning to live with the cracks in the mirror, even as I strive to create something new. As for Claire, I don't know where she is or what she's doing. Sometimes I wonder if she's found peace, if she's happy. I hope she has. But I know that her story and mine have come to an end. And that's okay. Some endings aren't happy. But they're necessary.